Hey everybody, welcome back to the Branch 458 podcast. I'm Casey Ritchie. This week we have Eric Robinson doing the first episode of The Anatomy of a Grievance. And what is that? So Eric came to our branch president and asked if he could do a training geared more towards newer stewards and how to do the basic things, filling out an 8190, how to be effective as a representative in the investigative interview or the pre-disciplinary interview, whatever you call it in your area, things like that. So Eric did his first training on Thursday within our branch, and we recorded that Zoom, and we are going to put it out here for everybody to hear, so that we can go back to it or we can point new stewards to it. So if you know of anybody that's a newer steward or wants to learn a little bit more about that role, feel free to point them to these episodes. They will all be titled Anatomy of a Grievance, Episode 1, and so on. We plan on doing this once a month. So look for these once a month, and Eric will be putting these on. He did all the groundwork, and he did a fantastic job. You will hear kind of at the end, it kind of ends a little bit abruptly. And the reason for that is because at the end of the Zoom, we open it up for questions from the people on the Zoom. And so that they feel like they can ask whatever questions they feel in that Zoom. We have decided to not put that out there, so we are ending it whenever the members of the Zoom start asking questions. So if anyone listening to this podcast has any questions or comments, anything you want changed, or maybe a little bit something needs to be clarified, feel free to email 458podcast@gmail.com and we will get back to you. But the next thing you will hear is Eric with the Anatomy of a Grievance, Episode 1, the investigative interview. I hope everybody enjoys it.
The thought about having this Zoom training, what kind of came into my mind was that when I was new or as a steward, there were just some basics that I wasn't grasping very well or that I wasn't retaining. And a few months back, I talked to Eric and Ken about it, and I thought it might be just kind of a good idea to have kind of some go over some basics with anybody that wanted to go over them, even if you're someone that's been doing a lot of grievances or someone that's never done a grievance. There might be some helpful things in the information I'm going to talk about tonight. A lot of it's just kind of from my experience and from some trainings that I've been at. There was a training in Ardmore, a rap session, and he talked about the steward's role in the II, and I learned a lot from that. And so that kind of inspired tonight's topic. There's going to be multiple of these. I don't know how many trainings we're going to do like this, but I have a few topics in mind. And kind of what came to my mind was the thought of like the anatomy of a grievance, kind of for someone that maybe needs a little bit more confidence or some experience. Like if you're starting at square one, kind of what do you do? That's been a question sometimes I'd get from newer stewards or from alternates is, well, this is great that I'm an alternate or that I'm a steward, but there's a couple of things that I wouldn't know where to start. The investigative interview, as you can see on my notes here, I probably do more IIs than anything else I do as a steward. And that's because if management doesn't do an II and if they issue discipline, that becomes a serious due process violation. And that is a surefire way to get discipline thrown out. So anyway, we're going to start with the investigative interview. Next month, I'll talk about what do you do after the II if they issue discipline. I remember when I was new, that was something that made me nervous the first time. And I'm pretty sure I was immediately on the phone with like Eric View or Ken or somebody, immediately trying to get help. So that's kind of why I wanted to start with this, because this is always going to be kind of the first thing that happens with a discipline grievance, and you have two types of grievances. You have discipline grievance, and then you have a Sean Cole. That's Casey, you're hilarious. I was looking at the names of the people that are in here. That's another supervisor that I have a great relationship with. But anyway, we'll start with the investigative interview. The second training will be kind of what to do afterwards, and I'll kind of walk you through some of the steps of where to find information. What are the first things you do to investigate, a discipline grievance? And we'll just kind of go all the way through to the end of either resolving it and all the kind of nuances that I've learned along the way that go with that, including sending it up to Formal A, kind of how to put your file together. So from now till 6 months from now, 10 months from now, however many trainings we end up making this, I'll try to be thorough and cover every one of those topics. And like I mentioned earlier, if you got any questions you think of, pen and paper, write them down. I'd also encourage anyone to take notes, grab a notepad and a pen. That helps me with learning. And it's also something maybe later on you can go back and look at. So like I mentioned, this is their day in court. This is the opportunity for the management to determine if a letter of warning, a 7-day, a 14-day, if some type of discipline needs to be issued. Now, sometimes, and I also want to say a lot of times, managers already have their mind made up. But the investigative interview is a crucial part of this whole grievance procedure, because this is where we get to get facts on the record. This is where, as a steward, when I'm going through and investigating a grievance and preparing to meet it in Formal A, I get to go back and look at what facts did the carrier, share during the II. What was his answers to management's accusations? And I remember initially, the first couple of times I did an II, to me, it was just kind of like taking notes. It's kind of how I thought about it. Hey, I'm just in there, to take some notes, to have a record of everything that's transpires. And while that is a huge part of it, and that is a big element, there's a lot of other things that I'm going to talk about tonight for the investigative interview with our role. And, maybe this will help you instead of just kind of passively participating in an II, maybe it'll kind of help you go to the next level and give you some tips and tricks that maybe you hadn't thought of before. Article 16, underneath the just cause principles. And I want to show you, how do I get my browser here? Hang on. So under Article 16, it goes through the just cause principles. Before management can issue discipline, there's certain elements that they have to meet. Is there a rule? Is the rule reasonable rule? Is the rule consistently and equitably enforced? Well, one of these key parts, and I have it right here on the screen, was a thorough investigation completed. And I'm going to read this. Before administering the discipline, management must make an investigation to determine whether the employee committed the offense. Management must ensure that its investigation is thorough and objective. And this is the employee's day in court privilege. Employees have the right to know with reasonable detail what the charges are and to be given a reasonable opportunity to defend themselves before the discipline is initiated. And so kind of like what I had, oh goodness, you guys gotta forgive me. I'm not real good at this yet. Hang on, let me get back to my browser. Oh, there we go. I don't make that go away. Okay. And so kind of like what we read, they have the right to know with reasonable detail what the charges are. If they take you into an II and they don't tell the carrier up front what's going on, or if they refuse to tell you, the moment you find out what it is, you request to have a consultation with the carrier, and I'll get into that a little bit more. Weingarten rights is kind of where the carrier has the right to have us there. That's where we get that from. This is under Article 17. And for anybody that's not familiar with it, I wanted to read this briefly with this as well. And this is something you should become loosely familiar with. Take the time and go ahead and read it at some point. Right here, federal labor law. And what is known as Weingarten Rule gives each employee the right to representation during any investigative interview when he or she reasonably believes it could lead to discipline. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that official discussions are not the same as IIs. and Weingarten rights do not apply to that. So if management pulls a carrier aside and they're like, hey, I need to talk to you about this package the other day, you may see, and I've had it before, the carrier may pipe up and be like, I want my steward, where's Eric at? And then the supervisor's trying to tell them, hey, you don't need your steward right now. If they're not asking questions that could lead to discipline, and the carrier doesn't have, that reasonable thought that this could lead to discipline, they don't have a right to have the steward there. And so that's actually directly addressed here in 17. And there's some other things, fitness for duty, physical examinations, they don't have the right to. I'm not going to read this whole thing to bore you all, but this would be beneficial to you to go ahead and at least read it once and kind of get some of that information in your mind. One thing that's real important in here, which I'm going to talk about here in a second, is in a Weingarten interview, so in an II, the employee has the right to a steward's assistance, not just what's going on here? Well, this is a mess. Here we go. Not just a silent presence. And it says here the employee would violate the employee's Weingarten rights if it refused to allow the representative to speak, or if they tried to restrict the steward to the role of a passive observer. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're in an II and you're attempting to participate, and if the manager or supervisor looks over at you and is like, Ryan, you need to pipe down. This is my II. I'm going to be the one asking the questions. That definitely has occurred before, and it will happen again to someone. If you get in that situation, this is clearly violating, these rights in Article 17. What I would recommend is make a note of that. Even look at the carrier and say, hey, I need you to remember this. I'm going to need you to write a statement after I'm done. And I've heard a lot of people say at that point, sit back and shut your mouth and let them say whatever management wants to say, because that is a massive violation of their rights. And I would be shocked if any type of discipline that came out of that would hold any weight. I wouldn't think it would at all, because that is such what's called a fatal flaw. So that's important to know. Now, before the II, there's something referred to as a pre-consultation meeting. You'll sometimes hear it referred to when you go to different trainings as a caucus. What this is that before entering the office for an II, the steward should ask the supervisor what the issue is and request time to speak privately with the carrier. And then at that time, you get to talk to the carrier what it's about. This morning, I had 2 different IIs I did, and the supervisor in Edmond, I'm like, hey, what's it about? He's like, safety. And then he started like walking away. Well, I stopped him and I was like, sir, can you elaborate? Can you give me a little bit more detail on that? And then he told me, a brief detail. And I was like, okay. I asked him another question. What day did it occur on? Like, I want to go into my pre-meeting with the carrier being able to have a conversation with the carrier. So if you're ever in that situation where they don't want to share that with you, or they're just being a little, abrupt, definitely have the confidence to stop them for a moment and be like, well, hey, I feel like to have a proper pre-consultation, we need to know what they're going to be charged with. Could you elaborate? What do you mean by safety? Could you be a little bit more specific? I've never had anybody tell me no. Doesn't mean they won't. So you definitely want to know kind of what it's about before you go talk to the carrier. And it also says there in Article 17, when you're reading the JCAM, you go just a little bit further up than what we were reading before. The verbiage here is an employee must be given reasonable time to consult with his or her steward, and such reasonable time may not be measured by a predetermined factor. And then it has a step 4 decision from 1985 on there. It's M00303. Now, I have had supervisors tell me, hey, we need to make this quick. I got to get them on the street. I choose not to be confrontational. I just nod my head and I go, hey, man, sure thing. We'll take the, as much time as we need, and we'll try to be efficient with our time. And then I go talk to the carrier. I've had some pre-consultation meetings last 15 minutes. I've had some that have been, 2 minutes. So it's really kind of, it varies, but don't let anyone pressure you into thinking that you have some type of set time limit. Obviously, if you're in there for, 55 minutes, an hour or something, someone's probably going to call that unreasonable. So just keep that in mind. It's something good to know. Now, there's some things that you want to use this caucus, this pre-consultation meeting for. And the first one that came to mind was about managing attitude. Now, this is both for the steward and the carrier. You all need to be professional and unemotional. If you go into the II right out the gate, being needlessly argumentative, that's not going to help at all. It's definitely going to make the manager dig their heels in. If they hadn't already predetermined what they were going to do after this II, you just immediately starting with a sour attitude and being argumentative right out the gate will probably cement that in their mind. So I always attempt to be professional. I'm always friendly with them, even if it's a certain couple supervisors that I don't particularly enjoy being around. I always make sure I'm professional and unemotional, and I let the carrier know that. You're going to kind of have to feel this out. I had a II at a station a few months ago, and the carrier was kind of emotionally worked up. He was very angry about it. And we got to keep in mind, you and me and Casey and Eric and Bruce and Ken, we may be more used to these types of confrontational situations. You really have to keep in mind that if this is a carrier that either hasn't had an II in forever, or some of them may never have had an II. I had a carrier very recently, he's been here 25 years in Edmond, never had an investigative interview. I had to really explain to him what this was, what was going on. So be patient and keep that in mind in case it's someone that hasn't done it before, because they very well may take it personal. Thinking back to that example in Edmond, the gentleman was, I could already tell he was a little offended by the thing that somebody would even dare, to question him about stuff. Because in his mind, and he, rightfully is a good worker. He works hard. And so it's helpful to let them know that if you notice that their temperature's up, that they're already agitated, to just remind them, hey man, one thing we want to do is definitely keep our cool in here. They're going to be asking you questions that you're probably not going to like, but we have to maintain this type of professionalism and a calm demeanor. Otherwise, it's really going to get worse. And another thing is, we're going to want to practice how they might answer questions. And, in the ELM 6653, like I have saved there, it says employees must cooperate in any postal investigation. So I'll sometimes, depending on the carrier, let them know, you need to answer truthfully. Sometimes I'll mention to them, you don't want to say no comment, because I've seen carriers before want to say that, and they must participate. If they say no comment, that's going to sound guilty as sin. And I've heard before that in the grievance setting, as it goes up the food chain, that does not look well. Like if for some reason, if your grievance ended up in an arbitration and an arbitrator sitting there and going through the notes of everything, looking at the II, and they're asking questions and the carrier's like, no comment. I don't know. Not sure. I had an II one time over attendance, and the only thing the guy wanted to say was sick. Well, why did you miss this day, this day? Sick. So we want to make sure that we're using the pre-consultation to kind of prep them a little bit, so that they don't go in there and shoot themselves in the foot by just giving these answers like that. Now, another thing that we're going to want to use this caucus, this pre-meeting, is sometimes to discuss the why of a grievance behavior. And sometimes their behavior, the actions that they took, could end up being a mitigating circumstance that could be the difference between, someone getting fired and someone just getting, a 14-day, or someone getting a letter of warning for 2 years, or the supervisor agreeing to throwing it out. And there could be several different types of mitigating factors. For an example, let's say a carrier was driving with his door open. Okay. Now we know not to do that. Everybody's, understands it's kind of a big no-no. It's kind of a big topic right now with safety at my station and a lot of stations. But when you talk to the carrier about this, asking him the why, you may find out that he was starting to overheat, and he was trying to, get to the next block so he could pull over and, get out of the vehicle. That, he felt like he was, had a pounding headache, that he was starting to potentially black out or something. I mean, you never know, what could happen. So it always it always benefits you to kind of find out from the carrier, okay, you're saying this is what they're said the topic's about. You're saying, yeah, they caught me with my door open. Go ahead and ask them why. Say, was there a particular reason? Was there some circumstance that led to this happening? Because you never know what information may come out. And that, like I said, could be a big difference. And, sometimes they'll reveal life problems. I've had a carrier before let me know they were going through a really bad breakup. and with tears in his eyes was just looking at me like, man, I'm a mess right now. We brought that up during the investigative interview. And then when I had to meet on the grievance, that was one of the things I pointed out. I'm like, this guy has a great record. Like, he hasn't had discipline, for a long time, has no active discipline. And he told you he's going through some stuff. And he told you that he recently started seeing a counselor. Let's, can we kind of, let's keep this in mind. So a lot of these type of things can be very helpful in getting, these facts down in the written record, so that, and sometimes the carrier will just want to hurry through there. They don't like being in the II. They want to get out to their route and just get on with their day so they can forget about this. But you really got to take a moment during that pre-consultation and educate the carrier on the importance of them participating, and that this is their day in court to get these facts out, so that I can use them later on if I have to file a grievance to be able to provide a proper defense. Another thing I always do during that pre-meeting is I warn them to look out for accusatory questions. And I'll give the carrier an example. I'll tell them, I'll say, hey, they may ask you, why are you failing to be regular in attendance? Well, if you think about that question, it's automatically assuming they're, not being regular in attendance. Well, the purpose of the investigative interview is to find out, this thing, can they be charged with not being regular in attendance? So that type of question, you want to give the carrier heads up and let them know, hey, they may ask you these things. Be careful how you answer them. Keep your eyes open for this type of thing. Another example I love using with the carriers is, how often do you beat your wife? Now, if somebody asks me that question, you got to be real careful how you answer that, because it's implied in there that you're already guilty. The correct answer for that would be, I've never beat my wife. And so, a lot of times, with accusatory questions, you don't want the carrier to give a yes or no answer. You want them to be aware of what an accusatory question is. You want them to definitely have a heads up going in, to be on the lookout for it. And you'll be on the lookout for it as well. During the II, and sometimes I'll object to them. It just depends on the question and the circumstance. And I'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. One of the last things I always tell the carriers is to keep the answer brief and to the point for the specific question that they were asked. And I jotted down on here an example. If a member of management looks at you and says, do you have the time? My first instinct is to go, yeah, it's 10:30. Well, the problem with that is he didn't ask me what time it was. He asked me, do you have the time? And so not only did I, kind of not just stick to that one question, I gave him more information that wasn't asked. So we need to let the carrier know. And I've used that example before, and they'll kind of chuckle with me. And I'm like, hey, man, this is what I'm talking about. Keep it to the point, just to that question. I tell them always to be honest, because if they get caught being dishonest, let's say they threw mail away. Let's say they broke a customer's car window, and maybe management has a video of it on a Ring doorbell, and they go into the II and they're like, nope, wasn't me, never did it. Management's not going to tell you up front a lot of times that they have that evidence. So that's part of why it's really important for them to be honest. And so that's one of the things I always go over with them. Now, to kind of move on, after you're done with your pre-consultation and during the II itself. Earlier, when I was reading out of the J camp, it talked about us not being a silent observer. And when I was really new at being a steward, this is something I was kind of failing in my first couple of IIs. I was just thinking, hey, I'm here to take notes. There we go. No, while we can't speak on behalf of the carrier, you cannot answer a question for the carrier. You can counsel the carrier, if an accusatory question comes out. Before, I've kind of held up my hand and go, hang on one second. I'll look at him and I'm like, hey, Joe, I kind of view that as an accusatory question. So I'd like you to take a moment and think about your answer before you give that. We can encourage them, if they start to, I was sick. They ask the question, why were you absent on the day? Sick. I have before looked down and said, hey, when we were talking before, you gave me a little bit more detail about that. This would be a good time, I think, for you maybe to bring that out. Would you like to tell the manager so we can write down what you told me in our caucus? And then they might, and that's kind of goes along with coaxing relevant information out of the carrier so that we can get it on the written record. An example of this, like with attendance discipline, which is, one of the ones that we do a lot. Not just saying they were sick, but they might be like, I called my doctor that morning. He wasn't able to see me. He said he didn't have an appointment for 4 days. He advised me to go get ibuprofen, to take a hot shower, and to get plenty of rest. So I asked my teenage son to drive to Walgreens. We got some ibuprofen. I slept a good deal of the day. I took some more stuff later on in the evening. That is such a better answer, and that'll give you and me as stewards a lot more to work with versus just saying sick. Like, if you guys kind of see the difference there. And so that's what I mean by coaxing relevant information out of the carrier. Now, another thing we want to do in our role of not being just a silent observer, but participating actively in the investigative interview is to clarify confusing questions for management. Sometimes I'll ask a question. If you can tell right off the bat that the carrier's a little confused, sometimes I'll be confused, because whoever it is that wrote those questions may not have put a lot of thought into it. And so definitely just kind of pause and be like, I don't think he's understanding. Let's reward that. Let's talk about that again. And sometimes I would look at him, I'll look at the supervisor out of the corner of my eye and say, what I think Mr. Manager is asking, and then I'll kind of like reword it almost. And most of the time they kind of nod their head. A lot of times the manager doesn't seem to mind with that because they are wanting to get the question out. I've taken a break before in the middle of an II when I noticed a carrier started getting heated. This was the carrier that had told me, with tears in his eyes, that he had, recently gone through a breakup. And I remember looking at the supervisor when I felt it, kind of him getting mad. And I was like, hey, you know what? I think it'd be good to maybe take 5. Let's maybe step out, go have a smoke, go stretch our legs for a second. Is that okay? And, in that instance, the supervisor, recognized as well it was starting to spiral. And so whether they agree with it or not, you would need to speak up if things are getting heated, and tell them, hey, me and the carrier need to go talk for a moment. That his emotions are really building up here. And, that's another thing. If they expand the charge during the II, let's say initially they tell you, yeah, it's for safety, driving with his door open. And then you get 5 minutes in the II and they're like, now we also want to know on the 14th, why were you 20 minutes late to work? That's a full stop. And that's when I would look at them and go, hey, great question. We're going to step out for a minute and talk about it because we weren't prepared to discuss that topic. And then you go ahead and take the carrier out of the room and, have a second pre-consultation meeting with them, or I guess mid-consultation meeting. So, and you also want to make sure that the carrier's allowed to fully respond to any accusations and the questions. You don't want them to be browbeaten or mistreated by the manager. And be confident. Don't be afraid to object to not only an accusatory question, but if they're starting to be argumentative with the carrier. And I put my hand up before and I was like, sir, I'm not going to allow you to speak to him like that. I'd like us both kind of lower the temperature for a moment, and then maybe we could re-ask the question. The whole time I'm trying to stay professional and I'm trying to stay the calm person. And so, that's also kind of another role. Sometimes you're kind of the mediator when you're in the II, if the supervisor and the carrier are about to, go to blows. And so, and with accusatory questions, there's kind of 2 ways to handle it. One is to object to it. I've looked at a supervisor before and just point blank, I'm like, sir, that is an accusatory question. I'd like you to reword that. And I've had them come right back and go, that's not accusatory. Not at all. And so then I took a moment and explained to him, without being too rude, I explained to him the definition of accusatory, kind of explained how that statement's accusatory. And with one II in mind, the supervisor stepped back, he rewrote the question. And then about 4 or 5 minutes later, he threw another one at him. And it was very blatantly accusatory. You could just totally tell that this guy had his mind made up. And so I stopped him again. I'm like, Mr. Manager, we're not, no, man, that is blatantly accusatory. Once I did that the second time, he reworded it. And then the next, I think it was 4 or 5 questions, he started to read it. He paused. He kind of looked up at me. And then I saw him just cross question out. And he was like, okay, 14, 15, 16, 17, we're not going to ask those. So you objecting to an accusatory question can be very beneficial in helping the II. Sometimes, depending on the carrier, if you're pretty confident that they're going to be able to see through the accusatory question, sometimes I'll completely just let it go. And I'll let management ask that, because if they issue discipline and we've got 7 accusatory questions in a row, why are you failing to be regular in attendance? Why are you refusing to adhere to your schedule? Why are you refusing to obey my instructions to come to work when you're scheduled? When it's time to meet on the grievance, I'm going to look at that supervisor and say, hey, man, you didn't do a thorough and complete investigation. You weren't objective. You went in there, it was predetermined, and I had proof of it. And then you show them, the different ones. And that supervisor may not agree with you. But I know, like for myself, if I kick it up to Eric or to Bruce at Formal A or Casey, they're really going to be able to hang their hat on that. That's going to be very helpful in defending the carrier and making sure that, just cause is met if any type of discipline's issued. And so just remember that your management's equal when you're on 613 time, when you clock over to that. Don't abuse it. Don't be, a real jerk and all these things, but don't be timid. And be confident when objecting to these things, because you are their equal at that time. At that moment, you're no longer a carrier. You are a representative of the National Association of Letter Carriers, and you're conducting official union business in that capacity. Now, one other thought about, one other thought is sometimes I'll add questions or ask questions during the II. And you always want to be very careful with this. You can ask questions to bring out facts, but this should only be done to clarify management's question or to establish mitigating circumstances, as far as, why, this activity transpired. So you really kind of want to be careful with this. Facts are more important than opinions during an II. And so, I'll listen to a supervisor ask a question, and the way they word it, it's just making me grind my teeth because it's accusatory, but I'm letting that one go. And then depending on the question, I've been like, excuse me, I'm not allowed to answer for you. And I'll look at the supervisor too, said, but I am allowed to participate. And I'd like to add a question here. So we're going to call this 14A. And I'll write my question out. I'll read it for the supervisor so they can write it out. And then we'll add that question. I know before I've asked the question, I'm like, Mr. Carrier, when you mentioned that this happened and this happened, were you intending to break that rule? That would be an example of like a question you might ask. Or if during the pre-consultation, they mentioned to you, man, I got ibuprofen, had my wife call the doctor. I was eating chicken noodle soup. I was resting all day, and I didn't get out of bed because I was trying to do my very best to get better so I could get back to work. You may even ask that. Be like, what steps did you take to try to avoid missing work? That could be a question you could add in there if you feel like it. So once again, be careful with that. I made a mistake recently where I asked a question that I could have swore on a Bible that I knew the carrier had told me something. And I found an appropriate moment. I threw this question in there thinking, okay, he's going to say yes. It's going to be so helpful if they issue discipline. And as soon as I asked the question, carrier piped up, nope, didn't do that. So, it doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, you can make a mistake with that. So just really be cautious. And one other thing about the facts are more important than opinions during an II. Sometimes depending on the II, I'll let the carrier know this up front. I'll be like, hey, when you answer a question, give the bare bone fact of what happened. Don't dive into your opinions, your thoughts, your feelings on that, because that's going to help you keep it short and, keep it on target. And then afterwards, if you're working a grievance and you're needing to use your II notes, having stated facts like that are going to be a lot more helpful than maybe the carrier's just opinion of something where maybe they were getting a little emotional. I guess maybe like an example of that might be if let's say there was like an accident and they issued discipline, maybe put them off the clock. Carrier might say something, well, the reason I hit him is because that idiot doesn't know how to drive and they just blasted out in traffic, and it was ridiculous of them. Now, that's an answer that one of us very easily could give, if we were getting emotional and upset. A better way to word that would be, well, when I pulled up to the intersection, so-and-so driver pulled around the corner. I noticed immediately they didn't have a blinker and they were heading right for me. And I even tried putting in reverse, but I couldn't back out of the way before they smacked into the front of my vehicle. So that'd be an example of facts are more important than opinions during the II. Now, kind of to come to the end of the II, almost always they ask a question. And the last question is normally in the form of, this is when they ask, is there anything more you wish to add? Now, I've heard some people say no to that quite a few times. They just kind of want to get out of there, and sometimes I've seen stewards say, they can just say no to it. We don't want them to add anything else that can maybe get them in trouble. But the reality is this is an opportunity for them to, add to this written record any information that would be helpful in their defense, any circumstances that would mitigate, potential discipline down the line. And so an example of this, of something to add, kind of like what I have written out here, if you can read it, I have a problem. I'm got an issue with drinking and it's affecting my mood, my sleep, and this is contributing to, these instances where I've reported later to work. If that didn't come out during the questions, but that's something the carrier mentioned to you in the pre-consultation, that's going to be an important, life problem that should be taken into consideration. Hey, I was taking painkillers due to my medical condition, my workman's comp condition. That could maybe be an example. Me accidentally leaving the scanner in my truck was unintentional. I did not intend to do that. It fell out of my bag. That would be an important fact that you would want the carrier to add at the end if it didn't come out in the questions. I'm going through a divorce. I've got a life crisis happening right now, and this is affecting my temperament, my attitude. That's why I had the outburst and gave you the cussing the other day. Another thing to add, and I love when carriers put this in there, is something along the lines of, I always give my best effort at work, and me delivering that package to the wrong address was unintentional. It is definitely not what I intended. And under Article 16, under examples of behavior, sorry if you can hear that, my dogs are flipping out. It says here, management must still meet their requisite burden of proof, i.e., they have to prove that the behavior took place and that it was intentional. And I'll sometimes tell a carrier in the pre-consultation, I'll ask them, I said, hey, this is what they're accusing of. You said that you did it. Was it intentional? Was that what you were intending? And almost every time they tell me no. I'll look at them. I said, hey, at some point during the II, I want you to bring that out. I want you to say that. Because in Article 16, under examples of behavior, was it intentional? If it wasn't, I've used that more than once to get discipline thrown out. I mean, I've used other things, but that has been a big part where I'll look at them and say, hey, yeah, they made an honest mistake. They did this, but he even said it was unintentional. I've had a supervisor tell me that doesn't matter. And then I would pull up Article 16 and read it with them and show them. I say, hey, look right here. Was it intentional? I'm like, this absolutely matters. So that's just kind of my thoughts on that last question. How you advise a carrier or whatnot with that, maybe just keep some of these things in mind. Now, kind of coming to the end of this, as you're walking out of the II, you always want to tell the carrier immediately to inform the steward if discipline's issued. I let them know that if they do issue you a letter of discipline, brother, just sign it, just acknowledge it, put the date on there. You can even put the time. I let them know that signing any type of discipline doesn't signify any type of admission of guilt or agreement that they're guilty of it. But what that does is if I have to file a grievance, number one, I'd let the carrier knows on day one they got to notify me. I had a guy recently that waited till day 11, and it really kind of made things more difficult than they needed to be. Two, he didn't date it when he signed it, and he didn't receive it on the date that management put on the disciplined. So it was kind of one of those situations. Thankfully, the member management was honest and said, yeah, it was a long weekend. He didn't get it till Monday. So even though it says the 9th, he didn't get it till, the 12th. But if the carrier would have signed it on the 12th and had that in writing, it would have completely removed the possibility of them trying to say I was untimely. Also, if an II results in you in discipline and you having to do a grievance, you always want to write on the top of it steward's notes. And so if you're putting your steward notes in the grievance file, always label them as steward's notes. And that way, if your notes and the manager's notes are in there, and if there's a discrepancy, not only you can show that to management, but then if it goes to Formal A or if it goes Step B or even arbitration, they'll be able to look and compare the two between that. And that can be very helpful. Say, hey, this is not what was said at all. Look at the steward's notes here. This is what he stated that the carrier said. One other kind of last thought on here about the II is, and I heard this at a training. This is where I got this from when I was in Ardmore at rep session. The fellow talked about protecting your integrity as a steward. He was, talking about that if you lose your integrity, it's going to just kind of handicap your ability to be effective. You have to keep in mind that, if you act out during the II, if you try to be Mr., Billy Big Stuff in there and you're not being professional and you're just being needlessly rude, that's going to impact your relationship with that supervisor or manager going forward. So that way for your next grievance, that way for your next investigative interview that you have to participate in, you're going to be kneecapped, and that's going to hurt another carrier. Never lie or never, pull any shenanigans during the II. And so that's kind of, what we mean is as far as protecting your integrity as a steward. Now, I'll get to any questions. I saw the chat had a couple things in there. I didn't click on it yet. But one thing that stewards, alternates, anyone always needs to have, you need to make sure that you are registered on the members only portal. And the reason for this is it has grievance starters. There's different documents in there. You can do searches for M documents. And so for anyone, if you're not registered on there and you don't know or you're not set up to access all that, you really need to do it by the end of the week. Like, it's truly that important. And what you do here is you go to nalc.org, and it's this part, where's it at? Right here, members only. And when you click that, it's going to take you to this screen where you put in your name, your last name, your zip code, last four, your social, all this stuff, and you hit log in. And then once you log in, it's going to take you to a screen. You'll get different drop downs where you can access this information. And so it is, I'd say it's vital. I'd say this is like a must for any steward or alternate. You need to be registered on here. If you don't know how, reach out to me this week or somebody else, and we can kind of walk you through it and show you how to get in there. It's just going to be a massive benefit to you for that. I'd also say another thing is to be familiar with the just cause principles in Article 16. If you've never sat down and read it through word for word, that's an article you need to read, because if you're in an II and you already have in your mind kind of some of the stuff that I mentioned, like was it intentional? That might prompt you to go ahead and ask a question. That could potentially be a big difference in any potential grievance that comes out. And then lastly, a note here. Have someone you can call for advice and questions and then use them. Eric Bew and Casey have been huge helps to me. And when I was early on, I would contact Eric almost like every time leading up to a grievance, my first several ones, kind of asking them questions, checking things out with them, trying to get ideas. And a lot of times he'd point me in the right direction. So I wasn't shy from, reaching out to him. And that's kind of what we're all here for. So whether it's me or Casey or Eric, or, if you're an alternate at your station and maybe your steward's on vacation and an issue comes up, you're the steward at that time. You're not just a substitute that's never going to do anything. And so if you get in that situation where you end up filing a grievance or doing an II, reach out to these people for advice and help. Don't just do what I did for the first probably 2 years and just kind of settle and like, hey, Jerry's got it. I'll pick these things up along the way. Really get active with having a mentor and find someone that can be that go-to for you to kind of fill in any knowledge gaps you may have. So that's kind of the end of what I had prepared there. Let me take a look at the chat. I can figure out how to get to the chat. Here we go. Video note will not be shared. A thumbs up. Yeah, Eric B put something in here. I can't answer for you, but I can advise that you answer. That's a good way to go about wording something. And trying to think of an example when I might have used that. Eric, are you on here on the mic to where you could elaborate on that? Because I kind of like that.
It actually occurred up at your favorite station. Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It occurred at the one that comes to mind was Edmund Centennial. I was doing an II with the station manager up there, and he asked a question that was accusatory. And I pointed out that I felt it was accusatory and offered for him to reword it. And he refused. He wanted the question asked exactly how it was written. So I looked at the carrier and I said, I can't answer for you, but I advise that you answer that you feel the question is accusatory. And
that's excellent.
I believe I basically told him to answer, kind of like your example of, have you stopped beating your wife? And the answer would be, the correct answer is, I never beat my wife. So I advised him that he also felt it was accusatory and gave an answer that avoided the accusation altogether.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate your input on that. Eric put another thing here in the chat that everybody can see, keyword efforts. What efforts did you make to avoid this and future absences? Sometimes that'll be a question that management will add. And if the carrier doesn't answer it like they did in your pre-consultation, where for a fact that they did more than what they just said, yeah, I was sick, took some Tylenol. You raise your hand and be like, would you mind elaborating on that, sharing some of what you told me before? Or if for a fact that they did other things than what they just stated in that short answer, that might be an example of when you could add another question. Be like, hey, the question the manager asked was, what efforts did you actually make? Like, what specific steps? Were there any specific steps you took to avoid this and, absences? So that's real good. But okay, well, that's pretty much all we had on there.